The year is the early 1970s. A Memphis radio studio hums with the sound of old equipment, reel-to-reel machines whirring, the faint hiss of static on the line, cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air. A small crowd has gathered inside, the kind of audience that sometimes slips into live broadcasts, eager to hear controversy in real time. The host leans into the microphone, his voice sharp, self-assured. Elvis Presley is finished. His moment has passed. The young people today, he pauses for effect. They don't want him. They've moved on. His concerts? Empty seats. A ripple of laughter breaks from a few in the room, quick and dismissive. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, but strained, waiting for something else to happen. And then the question is put to you, the listener. What if, at that very moment, just beyond the studio door, Elvis Presley himself was already standing there? You know the door will open. You know he will walk in. But when? How? And what will happen when the man they've buried with words finally speaks for himself? The air crackles, heavy with anticipation. The crowd doesn't know it yet, but history is about to change. Live, on the radio. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The end of the 1960s was not kind to Elvis Presley. A decade earlier, he had been the unstoppable force, the boy from Tupelo who had electrified America with a new sound that rattled jukeboxes and scandalized parents. But by 1967, things had changed. The landscape of popular music had shifted beneath his feet, and the crown that once seemed welded to his head was beginning to slip. The Beatles had conquered the world, reinventing themselves with every album. The Rolling Stones prowled the stages with a dangerous swagger. Jimi Hendrix set guitars on fire. Led Zeppelin had begun hammering out riffs that felt like thunder from the gods. To critics, Elvis suddenly looked like yesterday's news. His pompadour, his polished smile, his Hollywood musicals, these were no longer revolutionary. They were relics. Even his own fans began to admit fatigue. He had made more than 24 films by the mid-60s, most of them light romantic comedies stuffed with interchangeable songs. At first, the formula worked. Quick shooting schedules, guaranteed box office returns, a new record tied to each release. But by the time Clambake hit theaters in 1967, the formula had curdled. The movies looked cheap, the scripts flat, the songs forgettable. The same magazines that once plastered him across their covers now asked aloud whether Elvis Presley mattered at all in an era of psychedelia and protest songs. Behind the scenes, Elvis felt the sting. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, kept pushing film contracts. Safe money, easy deals. But Elvis knew. He could hear the difference in the airwaves. His singles no longer charted as high. Radio stations that had once spun his records on loop now filled their playlists with bands from London and San Francisco. The youth who had once screamed his name were growing older, and their younger brothers and sisters were screaming for someone else. By 1968, whispers hardened into pronouncements. Elvis was finished. Articles declared him irrelevant, a relic of the 50s. Radio DJs, always eager to sound current, always sniffing for the trend, found it fashionable to sneer. Some did it with a smirk, others with a sort of malicious pleasure, as if burying the king made them kings themselves. But then came the night that refused to be forgotten. December 3rd, 1968. NBC aired a television special, simply titled Elvis. He walked on stage in a black leather suit, leaner and hungrier than he had looked in years. Surrounded by a small audience, he laughed, joked, and tore into the songs that had made him famous. Heartbreak Hotel, Jailhouse Rock, Lawdy Miss Claudie. Each one burned hotter than it had in a decade. Viewers at home sat stunned. This wasn't a fading movie star. This was the raw, unfiltered force who had once turned American music upside down. When he sang If I Can Dream, eyes closed, body still, the words seemed to come not from a script, but from his very marrow. The song, inspired by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy earlier that year, was a plea for hope, unity, and something beyond the chaos of the time. Millions watched. Critics who had prepared their knives found themselves standing in ovation. It was called the Comeback Special, and the title stuck. Yet even that triumphant night could not erase all doubt. In smoky radio studios across America, where the walls smelled of old cigarettes and the air buzzed with reel-to-reel machines, DJs debated his future. The Comeback Special was a spark, yes, but was it enough? The Beatles were pushing boundaries with the White Album. The Stones were darker, rougher. Bob Dylan had returned from seclusion. Against this backdrop, Elvis's return looked to some like nostalgia, not revolution. Inside those studios, the atmosphere carried its own kind of theater. The clatter of typewriters from the newsroom bled through the walls. Records leaned against the console. Vinyl sleeves smudged from constant handling. 2 ashtrays overflowed with cigarette butts, the smoke curling upward, as if refusing to leave the conversation. The hosts, slick with the confidence of young men who sensed their influence, loved to provoke. They would talk about politics, new music, cultural change, and when Elvis's name came up, laughter often followed. "It's bold to say it," one announcer chuckled into the mic, "but Presley's a museum piece now, a walking jukebox. Good for a spin, but nobody's buying the record anymore." Listeners phoned in, some in anger, others in agreement. But inside the studio, the tone was always the same. Dismissive, self-assured. It was the style of the time. To mock Elvis Presley in 1969 was to signal you were modern, plugged into the youth, not trapped in the memory of poodle skirts and drive-in theaters. They spoke as if declaring him dead gave them power. And in a sense, it did. Each derisive comment felt like a hammer driving the coffin shut. It wasn't just news, it was performance, a public burial carried out over the airwaves. And still, Elvis himself remained largely silent. He retreated to Las Vegas, to stages drenched in light and sequins, reinventing his shows with orchestras and karate kicks. In the desert, he drew crowds who stood on tables to catch a glimpse. But the broader world did not always notice. Away from those velvet seats, in the living rooms tuned to FM rock stations, the verdict was simple. His time was gone. This tension, between the man who could still ignite a theater and the myth being dismantled in radio banter, was the crucible in which the story would ignite. Because one night, in one of those smoke-thick studios where laughter came too easily and words cut too deep, the man they said was finished would walk through the door. And no one inside would ever forget what happened next. The red on-air light glowed above the studio door, casting its faint warning across the smoke-laden room. Inside, the late-night program had taken on a tone that was half talk show, half provocation. The host, a man in his 30s with slicked-back hair and the kind of grin that invited confrontation, leaned toward his microphone with relish. He thrived on stirring up debate, on cutting reputations down to size, and tonight he had chosen Elvis Presley as his target. The theme was advertised as, "The Old Idols, Do They Still Matter?" Around the table sat a panel carefully assembled to underline the point. A journalist from a national magazine who had built a career mocking rock stars past their prime. A pair of university students, both barely 20, with wide collars and restless energy. A local musician, known mostly for his bar gigs, who viewed Presley as the obstacle his generation had to overcome. They lounged with cigarettes in hand, drinks sweating on the table, as reel-to-reel tape machines hummed in the background. The host cleared his throat theatrically. Let's not waste time. The truth is this: Elvis Presley had his moment, and that moment is long gone. His films? Forgettable. His music? Out of step. He has nothing to say to the young people of today. Laughter rippled through the studio. One of the students leaned into his microphone, voice dripping with sarcasm. He's like a shadow of his own image, a kind of circus figure in sequins. People clap because it's expected, not because he matters. The other student joined in, eager to impress. When my younger sister listens to music, she doesn't even know his songs. She knows the Beatles, the Stones, Zeppelin. Elvis is something my parents used to play on the hi-fi. The host smiled, letting their words linger over the airwaves. The atmosphere carried a strange charge, mockery dressed up as courage. In that booth, where soundproof walls kept out the night, tearing down a legend felt daring, almost glamorous. The local musician stubbed his cigarette into the overflowing tray and said, "It's like clinging to a star that burned out. You can still see the light, but it's already dead." Silence for a beat, just enough to let the cruelty settle. Then the host leaned back, basking in the moment. That's it exactly. Elvis Presley is over. But radio was never a one-way street. The studio phone lines, open for callers, began to blink with red signals. The producer in the corner gestured to the host, but he waved it off, savoring his monologue. At last, he relented, flicking a switch. A woman's voice filled the studio, slightly distorted by the phone connection. Her tone trembled with indignation. "You people don't know what you're talking about. I was in Las Vegas last year. I saw him with my own eyes. That room was alive. People couldn't sit down. He sang like it was the last night of his life. Don't you dare say he's finished." The host chuckled, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Ma'am, nostalgia is powerful. I'm sure you had a fine evening. But one good night doesn't mean the man has a future." He reached for his cigarette, his smirk almost audible through the microphone. The woman tried to protest, but the line clicked dead. The students laughed nervously. The journalist scribbled something on his pad, readying another dismissal. The phones blinked again. Another caller, this time a middle-aged man with a stern voice. "You're making fools of yourselves. Elvis got us through years when we had nothing. His records kept soldiers alive overseas. I'll tell you what, without him, half your so-called modern music wouldn't even exist." The host raised his eyebrows, letting the tension play. And yet, here we are, with young people who barely remember his name. Music moves on, friend. That's how it works. The caller's voice grew louder. "Maybe it moved past you, not him." The line cut off. The atmosphere inside the studio thickened. Even the students, bold a few minutes earlier, exchanged quick glances. The hostility coming through the wires wasn't abstract. It was visceral, urgent. These weren't nostalgic sighs. They were defenses sharpened by real devotion. The host, sensing the discomfort but unwilling to surrender, pressed forward. He raised his voice, almost mocking in its bravado. "Look, I know some of you out there can't let go. But be honest. Elvis Presley is a memory, not a future. You can cling to the past, or you can grow up. The man is done." For a moment, only the hiss of the audio equipment filled the room. Then the phones lit up all at once, every line flashing, every button demanding attention. The producer leaned in, whispering, "They're flooding the board. We can't keep up." The host ignored him. He thrived on controversy. Conflict made for good radio, and the more people shouted back, the more powerful he felt. His voice sharpened, half laughing, half taunting. "Maybe you all should hear it plainly. Elvis Presley has nothing left to give. Not to music, not to culture, not to any of you listening tonight." He tapped his pen against the desk, waiting for the uproar, certain he had scored his point. Around him, the panel smirked, though unease flickered at the edges of their bravado. The studio reeked of cigarette smoke and tension, the microphones picking up every nervous shuffle, every exhale. What none of them could see, at least not yet, was that the walls of this tiny studio were about to be breached. The arrogance in their voices, the laughter echoing in the booth, it was all about to collide with a reality they hadn't considered possible. And when it did, the air would change forever. The studio's air felt brittle, like static waiting for a strike of lightning. The host leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his provocation, his voice dripping with superiority as he delivered what he thought would be the final word. "Even if Elvis Presley walked through this door tonight, it wouldn't change a thing. His era is finished." The words hung heavy, almost daring fate to answer. Laughter broke out among the panel, a journalist shaking his head, one of the students clapping mockingly against the table, the guitarist smirking as he lit another cigarette. The smoke curled upward, thick and sour, swirling beneath the red on-air light. And then, something subtle. A faint creak in the hallway beyond the studio door. The kind of sound you'd dismiss on any other night. A hinge, or maybe footsteps on the linoleum floor outside. One of the students paused mid-laugh, eyes flicking toward the door. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, half smiling, half nervous. The others ignored him. The host pressed on, raising his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth can be uncomfortable. Elvis Presley is yesterday's man. Today belongs to someone else." But the sound came again, this time clearer. A metallic click, as if the handle of the studio door had been tested from the other side. The laughter faltered. The journalist shifted in his seat, pen frozen above his notepad. Even the buzzing of the equipment seemed to soften, leaving space for that faint, unmistakable noise. Someone in the corner muttered under their breath, "No way!" The host tried to laugh it off, though a crack of unease cut through his tone. "What's this? A prank? Someone playing games in the hallway?" His hand brushed at the microphone cable as if anchoring himself. Then it happened. The studio door swung open with a slow, steady weight. Not theatrical, not hurried, simply deliberate. Light from the corridor spilled into the room, cutting a sharp rectangle across the smoke-filled air. For a heartbeat, the doorway was only shadow and silhouette. And then he was there. Elvis Presley. Not in rhinestones or capes, not the exaggerated figure from the Vegas stage. He wore a simple dark suit, tailored but unflashy, with a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His hair, still thick, caught the corridor light as he stepped inside. There was no orchestra behind him, no fanfare, just the quiet authority of a man who carried the weight of his own legend. The room froze. One of the students inhaled sharply, his bravado dissolving. The guitarist dropped his cigarette onto the floor, crushing it with the heel of his boot without realizing. The journalist set down his pen, eyes wide. The host's smile faltered. His fingers, slick with sweat, slipped against the microphone, sending a dull thud through the speakers. For the first time that night, his voice deserted him. Elvis didn't rush. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking softly, and took a few steps forward. His shoes struck the floor with an echo that seemed louder than it should have been. The air thickened, the silence pulling every breath taut. His eyes swept the room, calm but unyielding. Not angry, not amused, just present. He looked like a man who had heard every word and chosen this moment to appear. At last, he spoke. His voice was steady, resonant, carrying the faint rasp that radio microphones loved. "I hear you think I'm finished." The line cut through the tension like a blade. No one moved. The students stared at their hands. The guitarist swallowed hard, throat dry. The journalist leaned back, lips parted but speechless. The host, who had spent the last hour building his empire of mockery, tried to muster a laugh. It came out thin, brittle. "Well, well, look who decided to join us. Our guest from the past." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, missing the handle on the first try. The microphones captured everything: the shuffle of papers, the squeak of a chair, the nervous clearing of throats. Listeners at home could sense the shift, even if they couldn't see it. Something had cracked in the bravado of that room. Elvis stepped closer, his voice low but carrying. "You talk about me like I'm not still here. Like I don't still sing, still stand on a stage, still give every ounce of myself to the people who show up. You think you know what's left in me?" The host tried again, desperate to regain control. "Well, Mr. Presley, it's an honor, of course. But times change. The world's moved on. You can't deny that." His words stumbled, fighting against the tremor in his throat. Elvis tilted his head, not answering yet. His presence alone filled the studio, shrinking the swagger of every man at that table. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Outside the booth, producers pressed their headphones tighter, sensing they were in the middle of something historic. The phone lines blinked red with new calls, but no one dared answer. The host dropped his pen. It clattered onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the suffocating quiet. And Elvis, calm as stone, leaned closer to the microphone and said again, this time slower, each word carved into the air, "I heard you say I'm finished." The moment froze there, hanging heavy in the live broadcast. Listeners across the city sat in their living rooms, radios humming, hearts racing, as they waited for what would come next. For a few seconds, no one dared to breathe. The microphones picked up only the faint whir of the tape machines and the low crackle of the overhead lights. It was as though the studio itself was holding its breath. Elvis had spoken, and his words had landed with a weight that none of the men in that room had expected. The host, who only moments ago had wielded his authority with careless confidence, forced a crooked smile onto his face. He adjusted his headset, his knuckles white against the plastic, and tried for humor. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice pitching higher than usual. "A ghost from the jukebox has decided to haunt us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley in the flesh." No one laughed. Elvis lowered himself into the chair opposite the host. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if he were claiming his place at the table, rather than asking permission. The leather of his jacket creaked faintly as he leaned forward, his hands folding neatly in front of him. He didn't need the spotlight. His stillness commanded more attention than the host's theatrics ever could. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the microphone with a resonance that seemed to shrink the room. It was low, steady, and textured with the grain of a man who had lived every word he said. "Music isn't about being new," he began, eyes fixed on the host. "It's about telling the truth. People know when you mean it. They know when it's real." The words cut cleanly through the haze of cigarette smoke. The students who had mocked him earlier shifted in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their shoelaces. The journalist raised his pen, then set it down again, uncertain what to capture. The host gave a nervous chuckle. "That sounds noble, but surely you see what I mean. Every generation wants its own voice. The kids today, they're not looking to you. They've got their Zeppelins, their Hendrixes. Well, you belong to another chapter." Elvis didn't flinch. "Chapters don't close just because someone says they do," he replied evenly. "Last year, I stood in a hall in Las Vegas. People flew from Japan, from England, from little towns I couldn't even point to on a map. They weren't there for yesterday. They were there for tonight. They stood on chairs. They screamed until the walls shook. You tell me, what's finished about that?" The host shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing beneath the table. He tried to interject, but Elvis raised a hand, not aggressively, simply firmly, and the room quieted again. "You talk about fashion," Elvis continued. "I never tried to chase fashion. From the day we cut those first sides at Sun Studio, it wasn't about being in style. It was about singing something that felt alive. I grew up with gospel quartets in little country churches. I learned from blues singers who never had their names printed on a record. None of that was fashionable. But it was true. And truth doesn't go out of date." The journalist cleared his throat, his voice cautious now. "But surely you know the criticism, that your films, that period took the edge off. Some people think you let yourself be packaged." Elvis gave a small, rueful smile. "Maybe I did. Maybe I made choices that weren't the best for the music. But I never forgot what it was for. It's not about pleasing men in this room. It's not about headlines. It's about the people who buy a ticket, who bring their kids, who sing along in the dark. That's who I answer to." The studio had changed. Only half an hour earlier, it had been filled with the brittle laughter of men eager to score clever lines. Now, every sound seemed magnified. The shuffle of a shoe, the faint squeak of a chair. The students who had mocked him were silent. Their youthful bravado dimmed in the presence of a voice that carried more conviction than all their cleverness combined. The host, struggling to reassert control, leaned closer to his microphone. "But the times, they're restless. People want protest, revolution. They want their artists to stand against the system. Do you really think your music still speaks to that?" Elvis looked at him, his gaze steady, but not hostile. "I don't sing politics. I sing hope. I sing heartbreak. I sing the things people feel when the world is too heavy to carry. You think a man coming home from war doesn't hear himself in a song about loneliness? You think a young couple doesn't hear their own lives in a song about love? You don't need slogans to move someone. You just need to mean it." The host opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. His eyes darted toward the producer's booth, as if seeking rescue, but none came. The others at the table remained silent, watching. And through the silence came the unmistakable sound of the studio phone, a single, sharp ring. It cut through the tension like a warning bell. The producer glanced at the flashing light on the console, his face pale. More calls were coming in. The outside world was listening, reacting, pressing against the walls of that little room. The host swallowed, his throat dry. Elvis sat motionless, waiting, his presence filling the space so completely that even the smoke seemed to hang lower in the air. The duel had begun, and everyone knew who held the stronger hand. The phone kept ringing, its sharp tone breaking through the suffocating stillness of the studio. The producer, A wiry man with sleeves rolled to his elbows finally reached for the switchboard, his hands trembling as though he were handling live wires. One click, and the outside world flooded in. A woman's voice, shaky but resolute, filled the airwaves. "This is Margaret from Ohio," she began, her tone quivering with age. "Back during the Korean War, when my husband was overseas, I would sit by the radio every night and listen to Elvis Presley. His songs gave me strength when I thought I couldn't go another day. Don't you dare say he doesn't matter. Don't you dare." Her voice cracked at the last words, but the conviction was undeniable. In the booth, the students looked at each other uneasily. The host tried to brush it aside, clearing his throat. "We respect your memories, ma'am, but times change." That was... The line cut off before he could finish. Another call lit the board, then another. The producer looked panicked, gesturing helplessly at the lines that blinked in frantic succession. He opened the next. A young man's voice, bright and restless, charged through the speakers. "I'm calling from the dorms at the university. I listen to Zeppelin, to Hendrix. Yeah, all of it. But when Elvis sings, 'If I Can Dream,' I swear I get chills every time. You people in that room, you don't get it. It's not about whether he's the newest. It's about whether he's real. And he's real." The words hit harder than the host expected. The students on the panel, suddenly aware that their own generation was speaking up, sat motionless. One tugged nervously at his sleeve, eyes fixed on the desk. The producer switched again, his face flushed. Another voice, this one low and urgent. A man choking back emotion. "My little girl's been sick for months. Some days she won't eat, won't speak. The only time she smiles is when I play Elvis records by her bed. You think that's outdated? You think that's finished? To her, he's the only thing that makes the pain easier." The studio fell into silence so deep it felt physical. Even the host's bravado cracked. His lips parted. But no words came. The journalist who had spent years dismissing Elvis lowered his gaze, tapping his pen against his pad with trembling fingers. Elvis himself didn't rush to respond. He sat still, his expression somber, his jaw set. He didn't bow his head in dramatics, nor did he let tears show. Instead, he gave a slow nod, acknowledging the caller without trying to take the moment for himself. His silence was louder than any defense he could have spoken. Then, almost violently, the phones erupted again. Every line blinked red, the switchboard groaning under the demand. The producer shook his head in disbelief. "They're all full. We can't even take them fast enough," he muttered, though the microphones picked it up, sending the message across the air. The listeners were storming the broadcast. One call slipped through, a middle-aged man with a gravelly voice. "You boys in that studio think you're clever. You're not. You're standing on the shoulders of a man who built the road you're walking. Don't ever forget it." Another, "I'm a teacher. My students say Elvis is old news. But when I play them, that's all right. They light up. They get it. They feel it. Don't talk to me about finished." The chorus was relentless. Each call contradicted the narrative that the host had tried to build. It was as though the voices of America themselves had joined the room, their collective testimony pushing back against the smoke and arrogance that had filled it only minutes before. The host, pale now, shuffled his notes as if searching for a lifeline. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "Folks, let's not get carried away. Nostalgia makes us all emotional. But the next call broke him mid-sentence. A woman, her voice sharp with anger. "Don't you dare laugh. We've lived with this man's music in our homes, through hard times and good ones. You don't get to erase that with a smirk." The panel of students and the local guitarist, who earlier had mocked Presley with gleeful contempt, sat in stunned silence. The tide had shifted, and it was no longer fashionable to sneer. The crowd outside, unseen but undeniable, was speaking in a roar. In the midst of it all, Elvis remained composed. He didn't gloat, didn't seize the moment to humiliate his critics. He sat with his hands resting on the table, his face unreadable except for the faintest trace of resolve in his eyes. The producer leaned toward the host, whispering urgently but picked up faintly by a microphone. "The board's burning. We can't hold them all. They're still calling." For the first time, the host's authority had crumbled completely. His smirk had vanished, replaced by tight lips and darting eyes. He understood what was happening. The people, the audience he depended on for ratings and relevance, had turned against him. The contrast was overwhelming. Hours earlier, mocking Elvis had seemed clever, modern, bold. But now, live on air, the voices of ordinary Americans were dismantling that smug certainty, replacing it with raw emotion that no headline or witty remark could dismiss. And the man at the center of it all, Elvis Presley, hadn't raised his voice once. The host fiddled nervously with the microphone, but no one cared what he said anymore. The air belonged to the callers, to the unseen millions who were defending their singer not as an idol of the past, but as a presence that still mattered in their daily lives. The studio wasn't just a room anymore. It had become an arena, and Elvis had already won, without even trying. The phones were still blinking like warning lights on a storm-battered ship. Voices kept pressing in, desperate to be heard, but the studio had reached a breaking point. No one at the table spoke. The host, who had built the evening on ridicule, sat pale and rigid, his hand clamped around a coffee cup he no longer drank from. The panelists stared at the desk, unwilling to meet Elvis's eyes. And then Elvis leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "Let me answer them," he said, nodding toward the blinking board. "Not with talk, with what I know best." For a moment, no one understood. Then he looked toward the sound engineer behind the glass. "You got a guitar back there?" The engineer, startled, blinked. In nearly every studio of the era, a spare instrument hung on a wall for sessions or jingles. After a pause, he ducked out of sight and reappeared with an acoustic Gibson, its surface worn smooth from use. He opened the door and set it down gently beside Elvis, his hands trembling slightly, as though he were delivering a sacred object. The host found his voice, but only barely. This is a live broadcast. You can't just—" Elvis cut him off, not with words, but by lifting the guitar into his lap. The action alone silenced the room. He adjusted the strap, tested the tuning with quick twists of the pegs, and let his fingers slide across the strings. A few notes rang out, bright, unpolished, startlingly intimate after all the heated talk. Then, without announcement, he began to play. "That's all right, Mama. That's all right with you." The words spilled into the microphone, slower than the version recorded back in 1954, but deeper, richer. This was not the reckless shout of a young man discovering his power. It was something else entirely. It was the same song, but carried by a voice that had lived through fame, disappointment, and doubt, reshaped by time into something rawer and infinitely more human. The studio stilled. The students sat with mouths slightly open, their earlier bravado dissolved. The journalist stopped taking notes, the pen frozen between his fingers. Even the host, who had tried to control every moment of the broadcast, leaned back, eyes unfocused, his hand still resting against the silent coffee cup. The microphones captured every detail: the creak of the guitar's body against Elvis's suit, the faint rasp in his voice, the rhythm he tapped out gently with his boot against the studio floor. It wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, and that was why it felt like the truth. Outside the booth, the producer motioned frantically to the engineer. The call lines were exploding again. More voices than they had ever handled. Some callers were sobbing, others shouting, all of them demanding that the song continue. In living rooms across the city, radios hummed with that voice. People who had been ready to switch off for the night leaned closer, holding their breath. Couples who had grown up dancing to those very words found themselves transported back, not to a past they had lost, but to a present that still pulsed with the same fire. The second verse rolled out, not rushed but deliberate. "Well, Mama, she done told me, Papa done told me too." It was the old blues filtered through decades, through the weight of stardom and exile and return. Every note was a reminder that beneath the headlines, beneath the dismissive words of critics, there was still a man who could summon a room to silence with nothing but 6 strings and a voice. The host shifted in his chair, tapping his pen nervously against the desk. But he didn't interrupt. He couldn't. To break into that moment would have been to expose himself as smaller than even he feared. As the final chord hung in the air, the room stayed still. Elvis let it ring, his fingers lingering on the strings until the sound dissolved into silence. Then, softly, from one corner of the table, came a whisper. It was one of the students, his voice trembling. "I thought he was done. But he's better than all of us." It wasn't meant for the microphone, but it carried through anyway. Listeners heard it. And in that fragile admission, the entire broadcast tilted. The phones lit up once more, now with a ferocity that bordered on chaos. Operators couldn't keep pace. Men and women cried into their receivers, begged for the song to continue, for another note, another verse. Some simply shouted his name, as though their voices alone might reach him through the wires. Elvis looked around the table, then set the guitar gently against the chair. His eyes lingered on the host, who sat frozen, his face ashen. The king hadn't raised his voice, hadn't boasted, hadn't defended himself with clever words. He had sung, and it was enough to silence a room full of skeptics and ignite an audience larger than any of them could measure. The silence after the song wasn't empty. It was charged, alive. The kind of silence that follows a lightning strike when everyone waits to hear if the world still sounds the same. And nothing in that studio or in the homes of those listening would ever sound the same again. The final chord of Elvis's song still hovered in the air when silence descended. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but of awe, the kind that presses down on a room when something undeniable has just happened. Nobody at the table dared move. The only sound was the faint hum of the reel-to-reel tape machine spinning endlessly in the background. The host gripped his pen, tapping it against the desk with nervous insistence, desperate to reclaim control. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "Well, emotions are powerful things. Music can do that. But let's be honest, these are moments, nothing more. Tomorrow, people will be on to the next thing." But his words fell flat. Across the table, the journalist, who had once made a career out of writing smug obituaries for fading stars, leaned forward. He had been silent through the performance, his pen forgotten. His voice trembled, quieter than the confident tone he usually used on air. "I've written for 10 years that Elvis Presley was a ghost of himself. I thought it was true, but tonight, I realize I've been wrong." The admission stunned the room. The students exchanged quick glances, as though they had just seen one of their teachers confess a sin. The local guitarist sat slouched, staring at the floor, his earlier bravado extinguished. Before the host could counter, the studio door creaked open. The producer stepped inside, his face pale, his headset still around his neck. He bent down to whisper something into the host's ear, but the microphones caught the fragments. "Other stations? They're calling. They want a tape of this broadcast. They say their lines are blowing up too." The host's expression drained of color. He looked toward the glass booth where the switchboard lights blinked like a machine on the verge of combustion. Every line was engaged, red buttons flashing in unison. The engineer raised both hands in helpless surrender. "We can't keep up. It's like the whole city's on the line." For the first time, the host understood what had happened. This wasn't just a heated segment or a spike in ratings. Something had escaped the walls of that studio, carried on the airwaves into homes, cars, bars, army bases. The listeners weren't just tuned in, they were united, and their voices were drowning him out. Still, he tried to laugh it off. A performance in a small studio? People get carried away. It's the thrill of the unexpected. But it won't last. His words were unconvincing even to himself. One of the students, emboldened by the tide, leaned forward suddenly. "You're wrong." His tone had lost its earlier arrogance. It was filled with something closer to reverence. "I mocked him tonight. I thought it was easy. But when he sang, I felt it here." He pressed a fist against his chest. "You can't fake that. None of the bands we worship could walk in and do what he just did. Not without a stage, not without an army of amplifiers. Just him and a guitar. That's real." The host's jaw tightened. He tried to speak, but the phones interrupted him, shrill and insistent. The producer gestured frantically. "We can't shut them down. It's too much." Another call slipped through, this time live before the host could stop it. A man's voice filled the room. "I was driving my truck, headed back from a long shift, and I pulled over just to listen. I haven't felt like this in years. Whoever says Elvis is finished, he's a liar." The host scrambled to cut the line, but it was too late. The voice had joined the chorus, adding to the storm pressing against the walls of the booth. And then another voice, not from the phone, but from the corner of the room. The journalist again, speaking more boldly now. "What you don't understand," he said to the host, "is that you've lost. You can't laugh this away. The people have decided, and they're not with you. They're with him." The host's hand trembled as he tried to shuffle his notes, but the pages slipped to the floor in a clumsy flutter. He bent to grab them, his movements stiff, his composure in tatters. Elvis, still seated, hadn't moved much at all. He looked on quietly, his eyes steady, his presence dominating the space without effort. He hadn't shouted, hadn't gloated. He didn't need to. Every person in that studio felt the imbalance of power shift, as if the ground itself had tilted toward him. From the engineer's booth came another whisper, this one louder, more urgent. "Stations in Chicago and New York are listening in. They're patching our feed. They say it's history in the making." The host sat frozen, realizing in real time what he had done. He had built his show on mockery, only to find himself undone live on the air by the very man he had buried with his words. The studio, once just four walls lined with equipment, now felt like an arena with invisible crowds pressing in from every direction. The phones were the roar of the audience, the flashing lights, the thunder of approval. And at the center, Elvis Presley sat in silence, his presence more commanding than any spectacle Las Vegas could stage. It was no longer a broadcast, it was a reckoning. The studio felt as if it were pulsing with electricity. The host sat rigid, a sheen of sweat on his forehead, his earlier bravado stripped away. The journalist's confession, the storm of callers, the live song, all of it had cornered him. Still, he clung to the microphone as if it were a shield. "This is emotion," he muttered weakly. "It's moving, yes, but feelings fade. By tomorrow, it will pass." Elvis shifted in his chair, finally rising to his feet. The scrape of the chair's legs against the floor echoed through the speakers like the crack of a gunshot. He adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, and looked around the room. Every eye followed him. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you," he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of certainty. "I came for the people listening. They're the ones who matter, not headlines, not clever talk." He paused, his gaze sweeping from the panelists to the glass booth, then back to the microphone. "If they still want to hear me, then I'll sing for them." The room stilled again. The engineer behind the glass swallowed hard, already reaching instinctively for the spare guitar still resting against the chair. He lifted it, but Elvis shook his head. "Number, I don't need the strings this time." He stepped closer to the microphone, his hand resting lightly on the stand, and began to sing a cappella. There must be lights burning brighter somewhere. The first line of "If I Can Dream" filled the studio with an intensity that crushed every ounce of doubt. His voice, unaccompanied, was stripped bare of ornament. Nothing between the sound and the listener's heart. It was not polished for record or dressed up with backing vocals. It was raw, urgent, and undeniable. The panelists stared, spellbound. The students, who had once mocked, leaned forward as if trying to hold on to each word. The journalist's eyes glistened. Even the host, who had fought so hard to dominate the broadcast, sat frozen, unable to summon his defenses. Deep in my heart, there's a trembling question. The words were not sung as performance, but as testimony, each phrase carrying the weight of a country reeling from assassinations, war, and division. In that studio, the lyrics transcended entertainment. They became a plea, an anthem, a declaration that hope could still be sung into existence. The phones lit up again, but this time the producer didn't even bother with the switchboard. He just let them ring, the sound of bells layering beneath Elvis's voice like a strange, accidental harmony. As he reached the refrain, "If I can dream of a better land," the control booth glass fogged with condensation, the room so heavy with breath that even the equipment seemed alive. Then, suddenly, one of the lines cut through live, unmuted. A new caller. "Mr. Presley, this is Corporal James Walker. I'm calling from Vietnam." The studio froze. The voice, crackling through the Trans-Pacific line, carried the sound of static and gunfire faintly in the background. "There's a whole group of us, huddled around a radio on the base. We've been listening since the beginning. And when you sang just now..." His voice broke, then steadied. "When you sang, every man here stopped. We're thousands of miles away, but it felt like you were right here with us. You're our voice tonight." Gasps rippled around the table. One of the students covered his mouth. The journalist bowed his head. Even the host, pale and shaken, stared at the microphone as if it had betrayed him. Elvis didn't flinch. His eyes softened, but he didn't break the song. He let the soldier's words hang in the air, and then carried on, stronger than before. "Where all my brothers walk hand in hand." The soldier's static-laced breathing lingered over the line, a haunting counterpoint to Elvis's voice. The two sounds, one of war, the other of hope, collided live on the broadcast, and every listener at home felt the collision deep in their chest. The final line fell heavy. "While I can think, while I can talk, while I can stand, while I can walk. And then, with all the force he had, Elvis delivered the closing plea. While I can dream, oh please let my dream come true. The last note reverberated through the studio, lingering longer than physics should have allowed. No one moved. The soldier on the line whispered, "Amen," before the connection snapped into silence. The studio erupted, not in noise, but in emotion too deep for sound. The journalist wiped his eyes openly. One of the students muttered, "God," under his breath, his voice cracking. The host, broken, lowered his gaze, his pen lying useless on the table. Elvis set the microphone back in its stand with a gentleness that felt almost ceremonial. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, breathing quietly, as though the weight of the moment had passed through him. The silence stretched, heavy, reverent. And for everyone listening, in that room, across the city, on the other side of the ocean in the jungles of Vietnam, the truth was undeniable. Elvis Presley was not finished. He was eternal. The last note of "If I Can Dream" faded into silence, leaving the studio suspended, as though the air itself had been arrested. The phone lines still blinked like fevered heartbeats, but no one reached for them. The engineer stood frozen, one hand resting on the console, unwilling to move. Even the producer, normally a whirlwind of gestures, stood with his arms at his sides, his face slack with awe. For a long moment, the only sound was breathing, uneven, shaky, human. The journalist stared at his pad, the page blank, his pen resting against it uselessly. The students sat rigid, their eyes lowered, ashamed of their earlier sneers. The local guitarist had folded his arms, head bowed as though admitting a defeat too vast to fight. And the host, the architect of the evening's mockery, sat in ruins. His papers lay scattered on the floor, his pen rolled beneath the desk, forgotten. He lifted his face toward the microphone, opened his mouth, and managed only a broken whisper. "Mr. Presley, I was wrong." The admission echoed strangely through the speakers, hollow and brittle. For a man who had spent hours smirking, jeering, and performing superiority, the words came not as contrition, but as surrender. His voice cracked midway, and he turned away, ashamed to meet Elvis's gaze. Elvis didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply straightened, adjusted his jacket collar, and reached for his long dark coat draped over the back of a chair. With unhurried movements, he slid one arm into the sleeve, then the other, his silence louder than any rebuke could have been. He turned toward the door. "BB." At the threshold, he paused, one hand resting lightly on the frame. His profile caught in the dim studio light. He looked not like a spectacle from Vegas, nor the caricature the press had painted, but like a man, worn, steady, unbowed. His voice came soft but clear, carrying enough strength to fill the room. "As long as there are people who want to listen," he said, "I'll keep singing. Nothing more. No flourish. No dramatics." He opened the door, and the corridor light spilled across the studio floor in a pale rectangle. His footsteps echoed once, twice, and then the door shut behind him with a quiet, final click. The studio collapsed into stillness. For several seconds, no one moved. The on-air light still glowed above the booth, but the silence on the broadcast was unbroken. Millions of listeners sat in their kitchens, their living rooms, their cars, gripping the edges of tables and steering wheels, waiting for a sound that didn't come. The silence itself became part of the performance, a lingering coda, stretching longer and longer until it felt unbearable. Then the phones erupted again. Not with one or two calls, but with dozens, every line flashing madly. ringing over one another in a feverish chorus. The engineer finally leaned into the microphone that connected to the producer's booth. "We can't take them all. It's a flood. They're not stopping." The producer stepped into the studio, his voice rising, not to the panel, but to the staff around him. "Do you understand what just happened? We've been part of history. This broadcast will be remembered long after tonight. People will be talking about this for decades." The journalist wiped his face with the back of his hand, his eyes wet. One of the students exhaled a shaky laugh, part disbelief, part relief. "He just walked in," he whispered, "like it was nothing. And he changed everything." The host said nothing. His career as a provocateur, the very persona he had crafted, lay broken on the table in front of him. For once, he seemed to understand that silence was all he had left. Outside the studio, the city hummed with radios tuned to the same frequency. Couples held hands a little tighter. Veterans in dim kitchens stared at the speakers with tears on their cheeks. Young men who had never cared for Elvis before found themselves rewinding the moment in their minds, unsure why their hearts were racing. In Vietnam, the soldier who had called earlier stood with his comrades around a crackling radio, each of them quiet, as though the sound of Presley's voice had carved out a temporary sanctuary in the middle of war. And in homes across America, people felt that they had witnessed not just a song, not just a defense of reputation, but something mythic, a reminder that greatness doesn't vanish because critics declare it gone. The broadcast finally cut to static, then to hurried station identification. But by then, it didn't matter. The silence that followed Elvis's departure had already cemented itself as the true ending. Listeners would later recall where they were, what they were doing, the exact chair they sat in when they heard him sing in that studio. For many, it was as vivid as the day they first heard him more than a decade earlier. In that one night, with no spotlight, no orchestra, no spectacle, Elvis Presley had shattered the narrative that he was finished. He had not shouted, not argued, not demanded respect. He had simply walked into a room that dismissed him, and by the time he left, he carried the room and the nation listening in the palm of his hand. The myth had been reborn, and from that night on, no one who had heard it would ever again doubt that Elvis Presley still had the power to stop time.